The summer of 1931 came hard to the Powder River country of eastern Wyoming, pressing down on the high grassland like a flat iron on wet cloth. And by the third week of July, the creek beds east of Casey had gone to cracked mud, and the cattle were working twice as far for half the water they needed. The cottonwoods along the river still held their leaves, but the color had gone out of them. That pale, washed-out green that meant the roots were harder than the sky was giving. In the town of Casey itself, population 411, by the last census, the hardware store had not restocked its seed inventory because there was no point restocking what no one could afford to buy. The Banner County Bank had sent 4 notices in the past 60 days to addresses along the river road, and the postmaster, a thin man named Avery Kunspad, had carried each one with the particular care of a man who knows the weight of paper. John Wayne rode into that heat from the west. He had been 3 days in the saddle coming out of the Bighorn Basin, cutting southeast along a route that the ranchers used in autumn when they moved cattle to the rail yards at Casper. It was not his usual direction, and it was not his usual season for the route, but he had picked up work at a spread near Worland, moving a short herd for a cattleman named Fisk, who was selling down his inventory before the bank got to it first. The work had paid $41 for 8 days, and he had the money in a flat envelope inside his vest, next to a letter he had found 2 mornings ago in the grass beside the road. He had almost ridden past it. The envelope was sealed but weathered, one corner chewed by something small, and his name was not on it. The name on it was Clara Marsh, written in the kind of handwriting that belonged to an older woman, the loopets deliberate, the pressure even. There was a return address from a post office box in Casey, Wyoming. Below it, in smaller letters, a sender, Ruth Aldridge, Rural Route 4, Gillette. The letter had not been opened. Whatever wind or hand had put it in that grass had done so before the woman it was addressed to could read it. John Wayne had held it for a long time. Then he had put it in his vest and ridden toward Casey to find Clara Marsh. He knew nothing about her yet. He knew only that someone named Ruth Aldridge in Gillette had written her a letter that never arrived, and that 3 days of riding into the July heat of the Powder River country was a reasonable answer to not knowing why. That was the kind of man John Wayne was. Not a complicated man, and not a man given to explaining himself. But when something landed in his path that had clearly been dropped by someone who could not afford to lose it, he picked it up. He always had. The town of Casey sat on a low bench above the river, the main street running parallel to the water for 4 blocks before it gave out into gravel and then dirt. There was a post office, a general store, a feed and grain, a cafe called the Powder River Grill that served 4 things on a menu printed on cardboard, and the Banner County Bank in a sandstone building that was the most solid structure in town by a considerable measure. The bank had been built in 1908, with that deliberate permanence that banks of that era favored, as if the weight of the stone itself was a promise about money. By 1931, the stone was still solid. The promise was another matter. Clara Marsh had lived on Rural Route 2 outside Casey for 11 years by the time that summer came down on the Powder River country. She had come to Wyoming from a small town called Cora in the Green River Basin, the daughter of a sheep rancher named Edmund Blythe, who had run 2,000 head on leased grazing land until a hard winter in 1918 wiped out the flock, and the lease came due the following spring. She had been 19 years old when the family lost that place, and she had watched her father pack what remained of 11 years of work into a wagon bed the size of a dining table. She had decided, watching that she would not be the kind of person who was erased by a piece of paper with a date on it. She had decided it the way young people decide things they do not yet have the tools to enforce, with complete conviction and no practical knowledge of how the world intended to test her. She had married Thomas Marsh in 1919, a year after her family's collapse, at a small ceremony in a Methodist church in Rock Springs. Thomas was 24, a capable man with a quiet disposition and a thoroughness in all things that Clara had recognized as the kind of character that takes longer to show itself than charm does. He was not a man who spoke well in groups or made friends easily in a room, but he was a man who came back every day and did what he said he would do, and Clara Marsh had learned early to value that above easier virtues. They had bought the land on rural Route 2 in 1920 with a bank loan of $3,400 and a down payment of $600 that represented nearly everything Thomas had saved in 4 years of working cattle and a single winter in the coal mines near Hannah. The property was 160 acres, a quarter section, with a 2-room house that became a 3-room house in 1922, when Thomas built an addition himself in the months between planting and first hay cutting. The land was good land, not exceptional, but the kind that rewarded patience. There was a reliable spring in the upper corner of the property that ran clean even in dry years. There were 12 acres of bottomland along a feeder creek that held moisture longer than the upper slopes. Thomas had planted those 12 acres in alfalfa and had sold hay to neighboring ranchers in years when the grass went thin. They had one child, a daughter named Elsa, born in 1923. Elsa was 8 years old in the summer of 1931, a serious child who had inherited her father's quietness and her mother's refusal to accept things without examining them first. She went to school in Casey 3 days a week and helped Clara with the kitchen garden on the other days with a thoroughness that made the neighboring women in her smile when they heard about it. Thomas Marsh had died in March of 1930. He had been moving cattle from the winter pasture in weather that changed faster than it had any right to, a late storm coming in off the Byhorns with the kind of speed that March produces in that country. He had been found the next morning by a neighbor named Carl Dietz, 3 miles from the house, in a draw where the wind had built a drift overnight. The doctor from Buffalo drove out and confirmed what Carl already knew. Thomas was 45 years old. He had been in the field alone because Clara had the influenza, and Elsa was tending her, and he had not wanted to wake either of them. Clara had buried him in the Casey churchyard on a Thursday in late March of 1930, with the ground still hard enough that Carl Dietz and his son had to work for 3 hours with a pickaxe before the shovel was useful. She had stood at the grave with Elsa beside her and received the condolences of 31 people, and she had been grateful for each of them and had not broken in front of any of them. She had done her breaking later, in the dark, in the house Thomas had built the addition to, alone. Then she had gone back to work. The year following Thomas's death was the first year she had run the property entirely alone, managing the hay sales and the 24 cattle they kept on the upper slopes and the kitchen garden and the household and Elsa's schooling and the twice-yearly trips to the bank in Casey to make the mortgage payment. She had made both payments in 1930. The first had been difficult. The second had required selling the last of the cattle and a set of tack that had belonged to Thomas's father, but she had made it. She had walked into the Banner County Bank on the 22nd of December 1930 with $208 in cash money, and she had laid it on the counter in front of a man named Gerald Fetters, who was the bank's loan officer and had been for 14 years, and he had counted it twice and stamped her payment book and wished her a pleasant Christmas. She had walked home in the snow, feeling like she had won something, she had. But 1931 had not been 1930. The hay market had collapsed in January, not because the hay was poor, but because half the ranchers who bought from her the previous year had lost enough cattle to the winter that they were cutting their herds rather than feeding them. She had sold 7 tons of alfalfa at a price per ton that was 60% of what she had sold for the year before. The kitchen garden was good. The spring still ran clean. But the numbers on the paper she kept in the kitchen drawer, the one she updated every Sunday evening, with the care of a woman who knew that keeping track was the only form of control she had left, those numbers were telling her something she did not want to hear. The mortgage payment due on the 1st of August was $212. By the middle of July, she had $104.30. She had tried every door she knew to try. She had spoken to Gerald Fetters at the bank in early July and asked about extending the payment date. And Fetters had looked at her with the expression of a man who has had this conversation before and does not enjoy it, and is also not going to change his answer. He had told her that the bank's policy on residential agricultural loans did not permit extensions beyond 5 days from the payment date without initiating a delinquency review, and that a delinquency review on a single-earner widow's property was unlikely to result in anything she would find satisfactory. He had said all of this in a tone that was not cruel, because Fetters was not a cruel man. He was an institutional man, which was a different thing, and in its way more difficult to argue with. She had spoken to Carl Dietz, who had been Thomas's closest neighbor and his friend for 9 years. Carl was a decent man, and he had listened with his hat in his hands and then told her that he had already spoken to the bank himself about his own situation, and that he was 3 payments behind on his own property and was managing only because his oldest son was working in Casper and sending money home. He could loan her $20, he said, and he was sorry it wasn't more. Clara had taken the $20 and thanked him and walked back to her truck, a 1924 Ford, that Thomas had bought secondhand and that still ran because Clara had learned to maintain it herself in the year since he died. She had driven to Buffalo, 40 miles north, to speak to a lawyer whose name she had gotten from the Methodist minister in Casey. The lawyer's name was Harold Pfeiffer, and he had an office above a dry goods store on Main Street in Buffalo. He had listened to her for 20 minutes and then explained that her legal options were limited in a way that was not his fault or hers, that the mortgage document she had signed in 1980 was standard for its era and gave the bank considerable latitude, and that what she needed was not a lawyer but the full $200 by the 1st of August. His fee for the consultation was $4, which Clara paid from the 20 Carl Dietz had given her. She had driven back to Casey in the July heat with $120.30 and a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. The letter to Ruth Aldridge she had written on a Sunday night in mid-July, sitting at the kitchen table after Elsa was asleep. Ruth Aldridge was her mother's younger sister living outside Gillette, a woman Clara had not seen in 4 years, but who she knew to be both honest and, by the standards of that drought year, comparatively solvent. Ruth Reff's husband ran a small freighting operation and had contracts with the coal mines around Campbell County that gave the business a steadiness that agricultural work in that period could not match. Clara had written the letter carefully, the way she did all things carefully, and she had asked Ruth to loan her $85 for 90 days, at which point she would repay the full amount, plus interest at whatever rate Ruth thought fair. She had explained the situation plainly, without self-pity, because self-pity was not a tool she trusted. She had sealed the envelope and addressed it, and put it on the kitchen table to take to the Casey post office the following morning. She had not noticed when it blew off the table in the night. The window had been open because July in a house with no cross ventilation was a particular misery, and sometime before dawn the letter had gone out the window. The letter had gone out the window and into the grass for 2 days, before a man on a horse came along the Bighorn Basin route and saw it catching the early light. Clara had assumed the letter was sent. She had no reason to think otherwise. She was waiting for Ruth Aldridge to reply. The letter was in John Wayne's vest pocket when he rode into Casey on the 21st of July, 1931, at a little past 3 in the afternoon. He had ridden through enough small towns in his life to know how to read one in the way another man reads a newspaper. Casey in the summer of 1931 read clearly. The hardware store's windows were half empty. The feed and grain had a handwritten sign about credit terms that told him the terms had recently changed and not for the better. There were 3 trucks parked in front of the bank, which was 2 more than the cafe had. And in hard times, the ratio of bank traffic to cafe traffic told a man something about where the anxiety was concentrated. He tied his horse at the post in front of the general store and went inside. The man behind the counter was Raymond Stoker, 53 years old, who had run the Casey General Store since 1915. John Wayne bought a tin of tobacco and a bottle of soda water and asked, with the unhurried directness that was his habit in all transactions, whether Raymond Stoker knew a woman named Clara Marsh on rural Route 2. Raymond Stoker looked at him for a moment the way people look at a man who asks a pointed question in a quiet town. Then he said that yes, he knew Clara Marsh, and that she was a good woman who had buried her husband the previous year and was having the same summer that everybody along the river road was having, which was to say, a bad one. He said it without drama, just as information, the way a man who runs a general store in a small town learns to communicate efficiently, because he has said most things several times before. John Wayne thanked him and paid for the tobacco and the soda water and asked where rural Route 2 ran. Raymond Stoker told him. He watched the tall man in the dusty leather vest walk out to his horse, and he had the particular feeling that sometimes attaches to ordinary moments when the ordinary moment is not, in fact, ordinary at all. He would remember that afternoon for a long time. John Wayne did not go to rural Route 2 first. He went to the Banner County Bank. He tied his horse at the sandstone building's hitching post and went inside. The bank's interior was cooler than the street by perhaps 10 degrees, the stone walls doing the work that stone walls were built to do. There were 2 teller windows, one of them occupied by a young woman named Harriet Cole, who had been working for the bank for 7 months, and who looked up when John Wayne came in with the attentiveness of someone still new enough to the job to pay attention to everyone who walks through a door. The other window was unstaffed. Along one wall there were 3 chairs for waiting, and in one of them sat an older man studying his hat. John Wayne went to the teller window and asked to speak to whoever handled agricultural loans. Harriet Cole said she would get Mr. Fetters. Gerald Fetters came out of his office in the back, in the manner of a man who is accustomed to conversations. He does not expect to be pleasant. He was 51 years old, heavy-set, with a face that had the particular quality of men who have worked in institutions long enough that the institution's rhythms have become their own rhythms. He wore a white shirt and a gray vest with a watch chain, and his expression as he looked at John Wayne was the cautiously neutral expression of a man who does not immediately know what category of problem he is dealing with. John Wayne introduced himself. He said he was passing through from the Bighorn Basin. He said he had a question about a property on rural Route 2. Fetters asked which property. John Wayne said the Marsh property. Thomas Marsh, deceased, mortgage held by the widow. Fetters's expression did not change in a way that was dramatic, but it changed. He said that was a customer account and that he was not in a position to discuss it with a third party. John Wayne said he understood. He said he was not asking about the account. He was asking about the payment date. Fetters said the 1st of August. John Wayne nodded. He said he would be back before the 1st of August, and he thanked Fetters for his time, and he walked out. Fetters stood at the window for a moment after he left and watched him untie his horse and ride south out of town. He said nothing to Harriet Cole. But he went back to his desk and took out the Marsh file and looked at it, and then he set it on top of the stack rather than back in the drawer where it had been, which was not something he normally did. The road to rural Route 2 ran south from Casey along the river for about 2 miles before cutting east on a dirt track that climbed a low bench and then followed the fence line. John Wayne rode it at a walk, the heat still heavy at 4 in the afternoon, the dust from the road rising, and settling without any wind to move it. He passed a mailbox that said Dietz, and then, a quarter-mile further, one that said Marsh, the name painted in careful black letters on a white board that someone had taken the time to make neat. The property looked the way a well-kept place looks when it has been managed by one person through a hard year, maintained but tired. The fence lines were sound. The house had a fresh coat of whitewash on the front that did not quite match the older whitewash on the sides, which told him she had run short of material before she finished. The kitchen garden was good. He could see it from the rows straight. The plants healthy in the way that only consistent water and attention produce. The alfalfa in the bottomland was waist-high and green. Whatever else was true about the Marsh property in the summer of 1931, the person running it had not given up. He stopped his horse at the gate. A girl appeared from around the side of the house before he had time to dismount. 8 years old, dark-haired, wearing an apron that was 2 sizes too large for her. She stopped when she saw him and assessed him with the calm directness of a child who has been raised to look at things squarely. John Wayne asked if her mother was home. The girl said yes and went inside without another word. Clara Marsh came out a minute later, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She was 32 years old, medium height, with a posture that was not quite rigid but was close to it. The posture of a person who has learned that how you carry yourself in public is one of the few things entirely within your control. She had dark eyes and the particular kind of face that does not photograph prettily but reads in person as strong and specific. A face that was clearly the result of a great deal of weather and a great deal of decision. She looked at John Wayne standing at her gate with his horse, and she did not look afraid, which he noticed. He asked if she was Clara Marsh. She said she was. He reached into his vest and took out the letter. He held it over the gate. Clara Marsh looked at it for a moment before she took it. She turned it over and read the address in her own handwriting, and then the sender's name, and her expression did its own quiet work for a second or two before she got it under control again. She looked up at him and asked where he had found it. He told her. On the road outside Worland, 3 days ago, about 40 miles west and north of where she was standing. She asked why he had ridden it here instead of posting it. He said it seemed like it might be important, and he did not know how long the mail would take. She looked at the letter in her hand and then back at him, and her expression was the complicated expression of a person who has been managing alone for long enough that receiving help is almost harder than not receiving it. She thanked him. She said it was a long way to ride. He said he had been coming this direction anyway. That was not precisely true, but it was close enough that he did not feel dishonest saying it. He had been going to Casper, which was southeast of Casey by about 90 miles, and Casey was not directly on that route. He had added 2 days to find her. He did not mention this. She asked if he wanted water for his horse and something cold from the well for himself, and he said yes because refusing would have been unkind, and he was not an unkind man. She opened the letter while he watered his horse at the trough. He did not watch her read it, because that was her business, but he heard the single short exhale that a person makes when the news inside a letter is not what they hoped. He heard it and filed it and watered his horse and waited. When she came back to where he was standing, she had the expression of a woman reforming her plans in real time. She thanked him again for bringing the letter. She said her aunt had written that she was sorry, that they had had some unexpected expenses with the freighting operation and could not help right now, that she hoped things would improve. John Wayne said nothing. He looked out at the alfalfa in the bottomland. Clara Marsh said, mostly to herself. August 1st. He looked back at her. She seemed to remember she was speaking aloud to a stranger and straightened slightly. She said it was nothing. She said she appreciated him writing the letter out. He asked about the alfalfa. He asked her the yield per acre she was getting and the price per ton she had been offered. She told him. She answered without thinking. The way people answer direct questions from someone who clearly already knows the subject. She told him the yields and the prices and the hay market situation, and then stopped because she had told a stranger more about her financial situation in 45 seconds than she had told her lawyer in 20 minutes. He looked at the bottomland for another moment. Then he asked how much shorter she was. She was quiet for a moment. Elsa had appeared in the doorway of the house and was watching them with the same stillness she had shown before. Clara looked at her daughter and then back at the man with the high-crowned Stetson and the dust of 3 days on his vest. She told him. She said she needed $212 by August 1st and had $120.30. She said it the way a person states a mathematical fact, without inflection, because inflection would cost something she did not have to spare. He said he would be in Casey on the 31st of July. She started to say something, and he raised one hand, not a dramatic gesture, just the patient gesture of a man who has said the thing he intended to say and does not need to elaborate on it. He untied his horse and swung up into the saddle with the unhurried ease of a man who has done that 10,000 times. He turned the horse back toward the road. Clara Marsh stood at her gate and watched him go. She did not know his name. She had not asked. He had not offered it. She went back inside and made supper for herself and Elsa and sat at the kitchen table after the girl was asleep, looking at the numbers on her Sunday paper. And she could not decide whether what had just happened was real or whether the heat of July was doing something to her judgment. John Wayne rode back into Casey and paid for a night at a rooming house run by a woman named Vera Pogue, who charged 60 cents a night and included breakfast if you were down by 7. He ate at the Powder River Grill, a bowl of beans and a piece of cornbread and a cup of coffee, and then he walked the 4 blocks of Casey's Main Street in the evening light, which was the particular amber of high summer on the high plains when the dust is up, and he thought about what he knew and what he needed to know. What he knew, a woman with a good property and 11 years on it was going to lose it in 10 days because she was $92 short. He knew the hay market. He knew what alfalfa yields from bottomland looked like, and hers were good. He knew that the Banner County Bank would execute the delinquency review, and that the review would result in a foreclosure proceeding, and that the proceeding would produce a date, and the date would produce an auction. He had seen it happen. He had seen it happen in Kansas in 1927 and in Nebraska in 1929 and in 2 counties in Colorado between those years. He knew the shape of it. What he needed to know, whether the $41 from the Fisk cattle job, combined with what he kept in the flat account at the First National Bank in Cheyenne, gave him the ability to do what he had already decided he was going to do. He worked the numbers walking the street in the amber light of the Casey evening. He had $41 in his vest. He had $130 in the Cheyenne account, which he could wire transfer through the Western Union office if Casey had one, which he would check in the morning. That was $171. He needed $92 to cover Clara Marsh's shortfall. He would have $79 remaining, which was enough for the road to Casper, and enough for a month's expenses if the Casper work didn't materialize. It was enough. He had known it was enough before. He started walking, but he had walked it anyway because he was not a man who made decisions without counting. He went to bed at 9 o'clock in Vera Pogue's rooming house and slept without difficulty, the way a man sleeps when he has decided a thing and has nothing more to decide until morning. He stayed in Casey for 9 more days. He was not a man who explained his presence, and he did not explain it. He found day work with a rancher named Bill Hatcher who was moving a fence line on his east pasture and needed 2 extra hands for a week. The other hand was a young man from town named Pete Sorrell who was 17 and trying to earn enough to buy a saddle before school started. John Wayne worked the fence alongside Pete Sorrell for 6 days, setting posts in the July hardpan, and Pete Sorrell would say years later that the man had worked with the consistency of a machine and had spoken perhaps 40 words in 6 days, all of them about the fence. Hatcher paid them each $1.50 a day. John Wayne went to the Western Union office on the 22nd of July and sent a wire to the First National in Shyshan requesting a transfer of $92 to the Banner County Bank in Casey, Wyoming, held for his account, payable on July 31st. The fee for the transfer was $1.20. The Western Union operator, a young man named Davis Crane, typed out the message and sent it without comment, but he looked at the amount and the instruction twice because it was an unusual kind of transfer, not to the sender's own withdrawal, but specifically designated for a payment date. On the 23rd, John Wayne rode back out to rural Route 2. He did not go to the house. He stopped at the road and looked at the bottomland alfalfa in the morning light, and counted the rows and estimated the tonnage remaining in the field, and thought about what she could reasonably get for it before the end of summer. The numbers were decent. Not exceptional, but decent. The property, properly managed through the next 12 months, would generate enough to make the next payment and have something left. He had satisfied himself of that before he made his calculations. He did not give money to situations with no horizon. He did not stop at the gate. He turned his horse back toward town. Clara Marsh, who was working the kitchen garden when she saw the horse stop at the road, stood up and watched him turn and go, and she understood without being told that he was checking something. She did not know what. She went back to her garden and pulled weeds with the thoroughness of a woman who is doing one thing and thinking about something else entirely. On the morning of July 31st, 1931, John Wayne walked into the Banner County Bank at 9 o'clock. Gerald Fetters was already at his desk. Harriet Cole was at her teller window. There was one other person in the bank, an older rancher named Gus Walton, who was making a deposit, and who looked up when the door opened with the mild curiosity of a man who has nowhere particular to be. John Wayne went to Harriet Cole's window and stated his name and said he was expecting a wire transfer from the First National Bank in Cheyenne. Harriet Cole checked that record and said yes, it had arrived the previous afternoon. $92. John Wayne said he would be making a mortgage payment on behalf of Clara Marsh of rural Route 2. Harriet Cole said she would need to get Mr. Fetters for that. Gerald Fetters came to the window with the Marsh file already in his hand, which told John Wayne that Fetters had been expecting this or something like it, because a man does not bring a file to an unspecified conversation. Fetters looked at him and then at the wire transfer confirmation, and then back at him. He said, the payment required the full amount of $212. John Wayne set the $41 from the Fisk cattle job on the counter in front of Harriet Cole. Then he set the $9.50 he had earned from 5.5 days of fence work for Bill Hatcher. Then he said he would have the $92 from the wire transfer applied to the account. Fetters looked at the money on the counter. $142.50 in cash, $92 in wire transfer funds, a total of $234.50. He said that was $22.50 over the payment amount. John Wayne said to apply the overage to the next payment installment. Nobody in the bank moved. Fetters looked at the money for a moment with the expression of a man who is reviewing his options and finding that his options are not options at all. They are simply the thing that is about to happen. He could not refuse a full payment. The bank's policies were explicit about that, and had to be, because the alternative was a legal exposure he did not want to consider. He called to Harriet Cole to count it. Harriet Cole counted it twice. She called out the amount clearly both times, $234.50. Fetters made the notation in the Marsh account file in his own handwriting. Payment received in full July 31, 1931, plus overage of $22.50 applied to next installment period. He stamped the payment ledger with the bank's round stamp, the date pressing into the ink with a sound that was smaller than the occasion deserved. He wrote out a receipt on the bank's standard receipt paper, the amount and the date and the property address and the notation about the overage, and he signed it Gerald R. Fetters, loan officer, and he slid it through the window. John Wayne took the receipt and folded it once and put it in his vest pocket. Fetters asked in the measured tone of a man making conversation, that is not quite conversation, whether Clara Marsh knew about this transaction. John Wayne said she would. He thanked Fetters and Harriet Cole by name, which surprised Harriet Cole because most people either didn't know her name or forgot it after they learned it. He nodded to Gus Walton, who was still standing by the deposit window holding his own business and watching this one conclude. Gus Walton nodded back with the gravity of a man who has just witnessed something he is going to describe at supper for a week. John Wayne walked out of the Banner County Bank at 9:37 in the morning. He rode out to rural Route 2 in the full heat of the last morning of July. The alfalfa in the bottomland was bright in the eastern light, and the spring on the upper corner of the property was running, a thin silver line visible from the road, and the house with its mismatched whitewash sat solid and specific on the bench above the river. Clara Marsh came out of the house when she heard the horse. She was wearing a working dress, and she had flour on her forearms, and she looked at him coming through the gate with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not quite managing it. He dismounted. He reached into his vest pocket and took out the bank's receipt and held it out to her. She took it the way she had taken the letter, carefully, with both hands, and she read it. She read it twice the way Harriet Cole had counted the money, because accuracy mattered more than speed. Then she looked up at him, and her face did what it had worked all morning not to do, and she pressed it back under control, with the kind of effort that is visible to anyone paying attention. And he was paying attention. She said, "How do I pay you back?" He said she didn't. She said she did. She said she was not a person who accepted charity. He said it wasn't charity. He said the alfalfa in the bottomland would sell for enough by September to set her up for the next payment, and that she was going to manage this property for another 10 years, without any trouble once the hay market came back, and that he had bet on worse things with less evidence. He said it in the low, measured voice that was the only voice he had, the voice that did not ask for agreement or disagreement, just stated the thing and let it stand. She looked at him for a long moment. Elsa had come out and was standing on the porch, watching with her careful dark eyes. Clara Marsh's hands were holding the receipt the way hands hold something they know is important, with a steadiness that comes from knowing. She said, "What's your name?" He told her. She said, "I won't forget it." He said she didn't need to remember anything. He said, to take care of the spring on the upper pasture, and she'd have water through the driest years. He said the bottomland would do the rest if she let it. He turned and mounted his horse and rode back through the gate to the road that went south and then east toward Wasp Harbor. And he did not look back, because looking back was not how he managed departures. Clara Marsh stood at her gate in the last day of July heat with the bank receipt in her hands, and watched him go until he was a figure in the distance, and then a shape in the dust, and then nothing at all. She went inside and put the receipt in the kitchen drawer, under the Sunday paper with the numbers on it, where she kept the things that mattered. In Casey that afternoon, at the Powder River Grill, Raymond Stoker from the general store and Gus Walton and a man named Ed Brearley, who ran the feed and grain, were having coffee, which was a thing they did most afternoons because the alternatives were fewer than the population of 411 might suggest. Raymond Stoker said he'd heard John Wayne had made a payment at the bank that morning on the Marsh account. Gus Walton confirmed it because he had been there, and he told them the amount and the detail about the overage being applied to the next installment, and they sat with that for a moment. Ed Brearley said he had heard about a man doing something similar over in Johnson County 2 years back, a ranch hand who had come into some inheritance money and had used it to cover a neighbor's tax bill, but nobody knew if that was the same man or a different one. Gus Walton said it didn't matter who had done it before. What mattered was that Clara Marsh still had her place. Raymond Stoker said that was right. Then he said he was going to extend Clara Marsh 60 days of credit at the general store, which he had been considering for a week and had now decided. He said it out loud to Ed Brearley and Gus Walton because saying it in front of witnesses made it a commitment rather than an intention. Ed Brearley said he would do the same at the feed and grain. Gus Walton said he didn't have a store, but he had 2 cords of dry wood cut and stacked, and he would send his boy out to the Marsh place with it before September. Nobody wrote any of it down. It was not that kind of town. Vera Pogue, who ran the rooming house, told anyone who asked in the days that followed that the tall man had settled his bill, 60 cents a night for 9 nights and 1 extra for the morning he had stayed past breakfast. He had tipped her an additional quarter, which she had not expected, and which she put separately from her other money for 2 weeks before she spent it. She could never say exactly why. Pete Sorrell, the 17-year-old who had worked the fence line alongside John Wayne for 6 days, would tell people in Casey for 40 years that the man had worked without complaint in 100-degree heat and had never once raised his voice or spoken about himself. When the fence was done and Hatcher had paid them, Pete had asked where he was heading, and the man had said south toward Casper. Pete had asked if there was work there. The man had said probably. He had said there was usually work if a man was willing to do it. And then he had ridden away on a horse for his Pont Montegrau on the road to Casey, and then beyond it without hurrying, because hurrying was not something that road required. Bill Hatcher, the rancher who had hired them, said afterward that he had known in the first hour that the man knew cattle and horses and fence work and would not need to be told anything twice, but that the most distinctive thing about him was what he didn't say. He said most men who know a great deal feel the need to let you know they know it, and this one did not feel that need at all. By January of 1932, the alfalfa had sold. Clara Marsh had cut and baled the bottomland field in 2 stages, late August and mid-September, and sold 11 tons total at prices that had recovered slightly from the summer low. The yield and price together brought her $340, from which she paid the next 2 mortgage installments and had $47 remaining. She put $40 of it into a tin she kept on the top shelf of the kitchen pantry, which she designated for emergencies only, and she put $7 into household expenses for the winter. She repaid Carl Dietz the $20 he had loaned her in July with interest of $2 which he did not want to take, and which she made him take by setting it on his kitchen table and walking out before he could give it back. She thanked Raymond Stoker and Ed Brearley at their respective stores and settled both credit accounts in full by November. Gus Walton's wood lasted through the winter, and Clara made him a set of curtains from fabric she had been saving, which his wife received with a pleasure that surprised everyone, including Gus Walton. The property on rural Route 2 produced steadily in 1932 and 1933, each year a little better than the last as Clara learned the land with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She bought 4 head of cattle in the spring of 1933 at prices that the Depression had made temporarily favorable, and by 1935 she had a small herd of 11 that she ran on the upper slopes through the summer and brought down to the bottomland shelter in winter. The hay sales continued. The kitchen garden continued. The spring on the upper pasture ran clean every year, exactly as the man had said it would. Elsa Marsh grew up on that property. She remembered the morning at the gate, the tall man on the horse, the paper her mother had taken and read twice, the look on her mother's face when she looked up, with the particular clarity of a child who has witnessed something important before they have the language to name it. She had been 8 years old. By the time she was 12, she understood enough of the family's history to know what the paper had been and what it had meant. By the time she was 16, she had thought about it enough to understand that what had happened was not just the saving of a farm, but the saving of everything the farm made possible. Her education, her future, the years she would have that would have been different, harder, more constricted, built on a foundation of loss rather than continuity. She finished school in Casey in 1941 and went to the University of Wyoming in Laramie on a partial scholarship she had earned through academic work that her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Halverson, said was the best she had seen in 20 years of teaching in Powder River country. She studied agriculture and land management and came back to Casey in 1945 to run the property alongside her mother, who was by then 46 and still working the land with the same organized thoroughness that had kept it through the hard years. Clara Marsh did not speak often about the morning at the gate, but she kept the bank receipt in the kitchen drawer for as long as she lived on that property. And when Elsa came back in 1945 and asked to see it, Clara had produced it from the drawer without hesitation. The paper aged to a yellowish beige, the bank's stamp still legible, the ink of Gerald Fetters's signature still clear. Elsa had held it the way her mother had always held important papers, carefully with both hands. By the spring of 1952, 20 years after the summer of the letter, the Marsh property had grown to 220 acres. Clara had purchased the adjacent 60 acres from Carl Dietz's estate in 1948, when Carl died and his sons, both living elsewhere by then, had sold the property in parcels. She had bought her 60 acres for $800, which was fair, and which she had in the bank because 20 years of careful management had put it there. The alfalfa operation in the bottomland had expanded to cover the new acreage. She was selling hay to 6 ranchers in the Powder River country on contracts that renewed annually. The spring in the upper pasture still ran clean. She still had the tin on the pantry shelf, though it held considerably more than $40 by then. In the summer of 1958, Elsa married a man named Robert Collings, who was a civil engineer from Casper and who had driven up to Casey one weekend on a friend's invitation and had met Elsa at a church social and had come back every weekend for 3 months before she agreed to let him take her to dinner. He was a good man who had the quality that Clara Marsh had identified in Thomas before she married him. He did what he said he would do, and he came back every day. Elsa recognized it because she had been raised by a woman who valued it above easier virtues, and she had watched long enough to know it was real. Robert Collings moved to Casey. He ran his engineering work from a small office in town and came home at noon and at supper. and he learned the land with the eagerness of a man who has spent his career making things work and finds that farming is simply a different kind of making things work. He and Elsa had 2 children, Thomas, named for his grandfather, born in 1960, and Clara, named for her grandmother, born in 1963. Clara Marsh lived on the property until 1971, when she was 72 years old and her hip had made the farm work impossible. She moved to a small house in Casey proper, 3 blocks from the now closed Banner County Bank building, which had merged with a Casper institution in 1954, and whose sandstone facade was by then being used as a community meeting hall. She lived there until 1979, when she died at the age of 80, still in possession of all the clarity and refusal that had kept her alive through the difficult years. Elsa and Robert were with her. The bank receipt from July 31, 1931, was in the kitchen drawer of the house on rural Route 2, where Clara had left it when she moved into town. She had left it deliberately. She said the receipt belonged to the property, not to her. Elsa Collings understood this and did not dispute it. In the summer of 1991, 60 years after John Wayne had ridden 3 days from the Bighorn Basin to return a letter to a woman he had never met, the Marsh property on rural Route 2 outside Casey, Wyoming, was still in the family. It was called the Collings place by then, though the older residents of Casey still sometimes called it the Marsh place when they weren't thinking. Thomas Collings, 31 years old by that summer, was running it with the same organized thoroughness that had come down through the women who had kept it before him, a quality that seemed to breed true in that family regardless of the name on the mailbox. He had replaced the mailbox twice, but had kept the original board, with Clara's careful black letters in the barn, propped against the wall where he could see it from the door. The alfalfa operation had expanded to 90 acres of bottomland by 1991, the best hay ground in that part of the Powder River country, and Thomas was selling on contracts to 8 ranching operations as far east as Douglas and as far north as Buffalo. The herd on the upper slopes ran at 40 head, Angus Hereford crosses that did well in the country's particular combination of summer heat and winter cold. The spring in the upper pasture ran clean, as it had run clean every year since a man with a dusty leather vest had told Clara Marsh to take care of it. Thomas Collings knew the story. He had heard it from his grandmother and his mother in different versions that agreed on every specific detail, which was how he knew both versions were true. He knew the year and the letter and the 3-day ride. He knew the amounts. The $120.30 his great-grandmother had, and the $92 that had made up the difference, and the overage of $22.50 applied to the next installment. He knew about Pete Sorrell and the fence work and the 60 cents a night at Vera Pogue's rooming house. He knew that his grandmother had not known the man's name until she asked it, and that she had been standing at the gate in the last day of July heat when he told her. There was a frame on the wall of the Collings kitchen. It held the bank receipt from July 31, 1931. Behind glass, the paper aged to the color of old cream, Gerald Fedders's signature still legible in the faded ink, the bank's round stamp still clear enough to read the date. Beside it, in Clara Marsh's deliberate handwriting, on a piece of paper she had written sometime in the 1940s, and which Elsa had found in the drawer and framed alongside the receipt, was a sentence that read, "He rode 3 days to return a letter, and then he stayed to make sure the letter didn't matter anymore." Thomas Collings had grown up with that frame on the wall. He had read the sentence so many times he could not remember learning it, the way you cannot remember learning the words of something that was always there. He showed it to his own children when they were old enough to understand what a mortgage was and what a payment date meant and what it cost a person to be $92 short in the summer of 1931 in Powder River country. he told them. The man had not done it for thanks, and had not done it for credit, and had not done it because it was his business. He had done it because a letter had blown off a table in the night and landed in the road, and he had picked it up, and then he had followed it to its end. His daughter, who was 9 and had her great-great-grandmother's dark eyes and her specific refusal to accept things without examining them, asked what had happened to the man afterward. Thomas Collings said he didn't know. He said the man had ridden south toward Casper, and nobody in Casey had seen him again, which was the way those things ended when the person doing them didn't need an ending. His daughter thought about that for a moment and then nodded, the way a 9-year-old nods when something is new but also somehow already known. The property was still there in 1991. The spring was still running. The bottomland was still green in July. The receipt was still in the frame, and the frame was still on the kitchen wall. And the man who had paid the $234.50 on the last day of July in 1931 had been gone for so long that he had become the kind of presence that doesn't diminish with time but deepens. A name on a piece of paper in a house he had never entered, on a property he had kept for someone he had met once at a gate, in a county he had passed through on the way somewhere else, in a country that had needed, in its hardest years, exactly the kind of man who picks up what others have dropped and rides it home without asking what's in it for him.